The vast, blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean, stretching for thousands of miles, became the defining battlefield of World War II against Imperial Japan. Unlike the relatively confined theaters of Europe, the Pacific presented a challenge of unimaginable scale, an endless tapestry of water dotted with countless, often tiny, islands. For Allied strategists, the path to Tokyo was clear, a relentless island-hopping campaign, systematically seizing Japanese strongholds, one brutal landing at a time, until the home islands were within striking distance. The bravery and tenacity of the U.S. Marines and Navy who spearheaded these assaults are legendary, etched into history by battles like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Iwo Jima. However, beneath the surface of tactical brilliance and combat courage, lay a colossal, often unseen, adversary that threatened to be America's undoing, the tyranny of distance. The sheer vastness of the Pacific presented logistical challenges on a scale never before encountered in naval warfare. Pearl Harbor, the primary U.S. naval base in the Central Pacific, lay thousands of miles from the front lines. The few forward bases, like Midway, were small and offered limited facilities. Operating major fleet units, aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, required immense quantities of fuel, ammunition, fresh water, food, and constant maintenance. Each ship was a hungry beast, constantly demanding replenishment and repair. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, this tyranny of distance was a cornerstone of their strategic calculations. They understood that the U.S. fleet, accustomed to operating from well-established, fixed bases, would be forced to constantly withdraw thousands of miles back to Pearl Harbor or even the U.S. West Coast for major resupply and repairs. They believed this inherent logistical limitation would buy Japan crucial time to fortify islands, time to regroup, time to prepare for the next, inevitable American assault. Japanese admirals confidently predicted that America's aggressive, island-hopping campaign would inevitably stall, crippled by its colossal supply needs and the sheer distances involved. In their eyes, the vast Pacific itself was their ultimate, unbreachable ally, guaranteeing that the American war machine would always be limited by its umbilical cord to distant home ports. This fundamental assumption, however, was about to be shattered by one of World War II's most astonishing logistical revolutions. As the U.S. Navy pushed westward, it became clear that traditional naval logistics, reliant on fixed bases, simply wouldn't work. The relentless pace of the Pacific War demanded a new solution, one that could defy distance, conquer logistical limitations, and enable continuous, offensive operations. But in the ultimate display of American industrial might and wartime ingenuity, a radical concept emerged from the drawing boards: the creation of an island of steel, an entire mobile logistical support system. This was the fleet train, spearheaded by the legendary Service Squadron 10. This video will uncover the incredible untold story of how thousands of unsung sailors and civilian workers created vast, mobile, floating cities, a relentless armada of oilers, ammunition ships, repair vessels, hospital ships, and even floating dry docks. It's a tale of brilliant adaptation, immense human effort, and the game-changing impact of a logistical marvel, proving that in the Pacific War, sometimes the greatest weapon wasn't a battleship or a bomber, but the ability to bring an entire supply chain directly to the front lines, outlasting Japan and fueling America's path to victory. Before World War II, naval doctrine had always been rigidly tied to the concept of fixed, heavily fortified bases. A warship, whether a mighty battleship, a swift cruiser, or a nimble destroyer, was an incredibly complex machine with an insatiable appetite. It needed to regularly return to port for a complete overhaul of its systems. This traditional umbilical cord to land-based infrastructure defined naval power projection. A warship's needs were constant and immense. Fuel, battleships and aircraft carriers, in particular, consumed prodigious amounts of oil to power their engines. Even destroyers, though smaller, required frequent refueling to maintain their high-speed operations and long patrols. Without fuel, these powerful vessels were nothing more than floating hulks. Ammunition. Every engagement, from a carrier's air group launching planes to a battleship's main guns firing salvos, depleted vast quantities of ammunition. Replenishing shells, bombs, and torpedoes was a time-consuming and labor-intensive process. Provisions. Thousands of sailors on a single aircraft carrier needed fresh food, water, and other daily necessities. Long periods at sea meant running low on these essentials, impacting morale and health. Maintenance and repair. Constant operation in harsh environments, coupled with the inevitable wear and tear of combat, meant that ships frequently needed repairs. Damaged hull plating, malfunctioning radar, worn-out engines, or battle damage all required specialist equipment, dry docks, and skilled labor. Historically, fulfilling these needs meant a return to a major naval base. For the U.S. Pacific Fleet, this meant a journey of thousands of miles back to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, or even further, to the U.S. West Coast. A typical round trip from the Western Pacific to Pearl Harbor could take weeks, effectively removing vital combat ships from the front lines for prolonged periods. For a fleet engaged in an aggressive, island-hopping campaign, these enforced withdrawals represented an enormous strategic disadvantage. Each withdrawal meant loss of operational time. Weeks spent in transit and port meant weeks not actively engaging the enemy, giving the Japanese time to fortify their positions. Vulnerability. Ships transiting alone to home ports were vulnerable to submarine attacks, and the entire logistical chain was a target. Deceleration of campaign. The overall pace of the Pacific campaign would be dictated by the speed of resupply and repair, making a swift advance impossible. The Imperial Japanese Navy, keenly aware of these logistical realities, structured their strategy around them. Their primary bases in the Western Pacific, such as Truk and Rabaul, were strategically positioned. They believed the U.S. Navy would exhaust itself in long-distance operations, that its ships would constantly have to break off combat, retreat, and leave the battle zone for weeks at a time. This reliance on the tyranny of distance was a fundamental tenet of Japanese strategic planning, giving them confidence that they could absorb initial losses and prolong the war, wearing down the American will to fight. They correctly identified the umbilical cord as America's greatest vulnerability in the vast Pacific. However, U.S. Navy planners understood that this traditional model was a recipe for a protracted and agonizing war. The sheer distances and the aggressive nature of the island-hopping strategy demanded a revolution in naval logistics. The fleet simply could not afford to withdraw. A new solution was needed that would effectively cut the traditional umbilical cord to fixed bases, allowing the fleet to operate continuously, thousands of miles from home. The challenge was immense: how to bring the port to the ships, rather than taking the ships to the port. The answer would transform naval warfare. Faced with the profound logistical challenges of the Pacific War and the Japanese strategic calculus that relied on America's Achilles heel of distance, U.S. Navy planners knew that traditional methods of resupply and repair were utterly insufficient. A new, radical solution was needed, one that would shatter conventional naval doctrine and effectively eliminate the tyranny of distance. The vision was audacious: to create an entire mobile logistical support system that could literally bring the vital resources of a home port directly to the fighting fleet, thousands of miles from any fixed base. This revolutionary concept became known as the fleet train. The core idea of the fleet train was to create self-sustaining, floating cities, a massive, coordinated armada of auxiliary ships designed to provide everything a combat fleet needed, while at sea. No longer would battleships, aircraft carriers, and destroyers have to endure weeks of transit back to Pearl Harbor for replenishment or repair. Instead, the port would come to them, allowing for continuous, aggressive operations in the Western Pacific. This was a logistical revolution of unprecedented scale and complexity, a testament to American industrial might and strategic foresight. The ambitious objectives of the fleet train were clear: sustain continuous operations, enable combat ships to remain at sea and engaged with the enemy for months on end, without needing to return to distant fixed bases. This would drastically accelerate the pace of the island-hopping campaign. Provide full-spectrum support, deliver not just fuel and ammunition, but every conceivable supply and service: fresh water, food, spare parts, medical care, and even major battle damage repair. Increase combat effectiveness. Ensure that combat ships were always topped off, fully armed, and in peak operational condition, maximizing their time in the battle zone. Baffle the enemy. The very existence and operational effectiveness of such a system would defy Japanese strategic predictions, undermining their belief in America's logistical vulnerability. The initial conceptualization of this revolutionary approach was not without its skeptics. Many in the Navy, ingrained in decades of traditional doctrine, questioned the feasibility of operating such a vast and vulnerable support fleet in a war zone. The coordination, the security, and the sheer scale of the undertaking seemed overwhelming. However, visionary leaders like Admiral Ernest J. King, Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Fleet, recognized the imperative and championed the effort, understanding that this logistical revolution was as vital to victory as any new weapon system. The fleet train began to take concrete shape with the establishment of specific units, most notably Service Squadron 10, Service 10, formed in 1943 under the command of Commodore Worrell R. Rack Carter. Service 10 became the cutting edge of this mobile logistical revolution. Its task was to create and manage the floating base, a vast collection of specialized auxiliary ships that would rendezvous with the combat fleets in remote, often temporary, anchorages. The construction and conversion of these hundreds of auxiliary ships represented an enormous industrial undertaking. Tanker ships for fuel, cargo ships for ammunition, stores ships for food and general supplies, hospital ships for medical care, and crucially, specialized repair vessels and even floating dry docks had to be built or repurposed. This was industrial power applied to the most pressing logistical problem of the Pacific War. The birth of the fleet train was a pivotal moment in naval history. It transformed the operational calculus of the Pacific. No longer would the vast distances favor Japan. Instead, America was literally bringing its industrial might and logistical prowess to the front lines, creating an island of steel that would defy the tyranny of distance and outlast a bewildered enemy. This radical solution was about to unleash the full, continuous power of the U.S. Navy against the Imperial Japanese Empire. To achieve the audacious objectives of the fleet train, particularly enabling the continuous operation of combat fleets thousands of miles from fixed bases, required a highly diverse and specialized armada of auxiliary ships. This was the genius of Service Squadron 10, Service 10, the legendary logistical backbone of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Under the command of Commodore Worrell R. Rack Carter, Service 10 assembled a truly unprecedented collection of vessels, each a vital component in creating these self-sustaining, floating cities of supply and repair. The fleet train was far more than just a few cargo ships. It was a complex ecosystem of support vessels, each designed to meet a specific need of the fighting fleet. Oilers, AO. These were the most numerous and arguably the most crucial ships. Tankers carried immense quantities of fuel, diesel, gasoline, aviation fuel, to top off the hungry battleships, carriers, cruisers, and destroyers. The ability to refuel at sea, often while underway, was fundamental to extended operations, saving countless weeks of transit time back to Pearl Harbor. Ammunition ships, AE. These specialized cargo ships carried a vast array of ordnance, shells for battleships, bombs and torpedoes for aircraft carriers, depth charges for destroyers. Replenishing ammunition at sea was a dangerous but essential operation, often performed under the constant threat of enemy attack. Stores ships, AF/AKS. Carrying everything else, these ships supplied provisions, fresh and frozen food, dry goods, medical supplies, spare parts for every conceivable piece of equipment, clothing, and even mail from home. They were essentially floating department stores, vital for maintaining the health and morale of thousands of sailors. Hospital ships, providing critical medical care. These ships were fully equipped floating hospitals, capable of performing complex surgeries and caring for hundreds of wounded sailors and Marines, often evacuating them from forward battle zones. Repair ships, AR. These were true marvels of naval engineering. Floating workshops, they carried hundreds of skilled technicians and a vast array of tools, lathes, welding equipment, and spare parts. They could perform everything from intricate engine repairs and structural welding to delicate radar adjustments, allowing battle-damaged ships to be patched up and returned to combat readiness without having to leave the theater. Floating dry docks, ARD/AFDL. The ultimate expression of mobile repair, these massive structures were capable of lifting entire destroyers, or even light cruisers, out of the water for hull repairs, propeller work, and other underwater maintenance. Towed into forward anchorages, they brought essential shipyard capabilities directly to the front lines. Tugs, ATF/ATA. Powering much of the operation, numerous powerful tugs were essential for towing larger auxiliary ships, moving floating dry docks, and assisting in at-sea replenishment operations. Water barges and distillers, AW. Providing vital fresh water, either transported by barge or produced directly at sea via distillation plants on specialized ships, was critical for sanitation and drinking for thousands of men. The sheer number of these auxiliary ships was staggering. By 1945, Squadron 10 alone comprised over 400 ships, ranging from enormous tankers to tiny harbor tugs. This vast collection of vessels transformed remote Pacific anchorages, such as Ulithi Atoll or Majuro Atoll, into bustling, self-contained ports. These were not fixed, vulnerable bases, but mobile, adaptable logistical hubs that could follow the fleet's advance, providing continuous support. The operational complexity of coordinating this floating city was immense. It required meticulous scheduling, precise navigation, and thousands of dedicated sailors and civilian workers who performed their arduous duties far from the glory of combat. Their ability to deliver fuel, ammunition, provisions, and repairs on demand, directly at sea or in forward anchorages, was the linchpin of America's strategy in the Pacific. Squadron 10's diverse fleet of auxiliary ships shattered traditional naval doctrine, proving that with ingenuity and industrial might, distance could be conquered, and a naval war could be sustained on an unprecedented scale, outlasting and ultimately overwhelming the Imperial Japanese Navy. One of the most revolutionary and visually striking innovations of the fleet train was the perfection of underway replenishment, UNREP. This intricate and dangerous maneuver allowed combat ships to receive fuel, ammunition, and supplies directly from auxiliary vessels while both ships were underway, often moving at speeds of 8 to 12 knots. It was a logistical ballet performed on the open ocean, a complex dance of giants that became the very symbol of the U.S. Navy's ability to defy the tyranny of distance. Before UNREP, ships typically had to stop or anchor to receive supplies, making them vulnerable and time-consuming targets. In the vast, enemy-infested Pacific, such stops were a luxury the U.S. Navy could not afford. The development of efficient underway replenishment techniques was therefore absolutely critical to maintaining continuous offensive operations and allowing the combat fleet to stay on station for weeks or months without returning to a fixed base. The process of UNREP was incredibly precise and fraught with danger. The approach, 2 ships, a supply vessel, oiler, ammunition ship, or store ship, and a receiving combat ship, carrier, battleship, cruiser, or destroyer, would maneuver into parallel courses, often just 100 to 200 feet apart. Maintaining station in the open sea, especially in anything but calm conditions, required immense skill from both captains and helmsmen. Connecting the lifelines. Once in position, messenger lines would be fired from the supply ship to the receiving ship. These lines would then be used to pull across heavier transfer lines, thick fuel hoses, cargo cables, and telephone lines for communication. Transferring supplies. Fuel. Fuel was pumped through large, flexible hoses, sometimes at rates of thousands of gallons per minute. This was particularly critical for aircraft carriers, which consumed immense quantities of aviation fuel. Ammunition. Ammunition, often heavy and volatile, was transferred via specialized high-line rigs. Wooden pallets laden with shells or bombs would be rapidly pulled across the gap between the ships, a dangerous operation with explosives moving through the air. Dry cargo. Food, mail, spare parts, and other dry stores were also transferred via high lines or specialized personnel transfers. The stream. The entire process was known as the stream, with ships often remaining connected for hours, steadily topping off their vital stores. Sailors on both ships worked tirelessly, often racing against the clock and the elements. The dangers during UNREP were constant. Collisions, a slight misjudgment in course or speed, a sudden swell, or a momentary loss of concentration could lead to a catastrophic collision between the 2 ships, potentially disabling both. Fuel spills and fire. Fuel transfer carried the inherent risk of spills, which in a war zone could easily ignite from a stray spark or enemy attack, turning the operation into a massive inferno. Ammunition explosions. The transfer of live ammunition was perhaps the most perilous. Rough seas could cause loads to swing dangerously, and an accidental drop or collision could trigger a catastrophic explosion. Enemy attack. While usually conducted in relatively safe waters, UNREP operations were always vulnerable to surprise submarine or air attack, making the ships particularly exposed targets. Despite these immense dangers, the skill and discipline of the thousands of sailors involved in UNREP were phenomenal. They trained relentlessly, rehearsing the intricate procedures until they became second nature. Their ability to conduct these operations, often in less than ideal weather conditions, was a testament to their professionalism and daring. The perfection of underway replenishment was a true game-changer for the U.S. Navy in the Pacific. It liberated the combat fleet from the traditional umbilical cord of fixed bases, allowing battleships and carriers to remain on station for weeks and months, continuously projecting power. This relentless operational tempo baffled Japanese admirals, who were unable to match such sustained logistical agility. The dance of giants on the open ocean became a symbol of America's industrial and naval might, directly fueling the relentless island-hopping campaign and proving that the Pacific could be conquered not just by fighting, but by the revolutionary logistics of the fleet train. Behind the impressive statistics and revolutionary tactics of the fleet train lay the tireless efforts of tens of thousands of unsung heroes, the sailors and civilian workers who comprised the crews of these auxiliary ships. Their work, often arduous, dangerous, and monotonous, lacked the glory of combat, but it was absolutely indispensable to the success of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific. Their story is one of profound dedication, resilience, and the quiet heroism that underpins monumental military achievements. The crews of the fleet train ships came from all walks of life, encompassing a vast array of specialized skills. Oiler crews, these sailors faced the constant, dirty, and dangerous work of handling highly volatile fuels, ensuring smooth transfer operations, and battling the elements on deck. Their role was foundational to keeping the entire fleet moving. Ammunition handlers. On ammunition ships, these men performed one of the most perilous jobs in the Navy. Handling thousands of tons of live ordnance, often in rough seas and under pressure, required absolute precision and nerves of steel. An accidental detonation could instantly vaporize their ship. Stores and provision crews. These individuals meticulously managed immense inventories of food, spare parts, and other supplies. Their work ensured that everything from a critical engine component to a fresh apple made its way to the right ship at the right time, maintaining both operational readiness and crew morale. Repairmen and technicians. The repair ships were floating communities of highly skilled engineers, mechanics, welders, electricians, and other tradesmen. These civilian and military specialists could fix almost anything, from a damaged propeller to complex radar arrays, often working 24 hours a day to return battle-damaged ships to action. Medical personnel. On hospital ships, doctors, nurses, and corpsmen worked tirelessly, often under immense emotional strain, to save the lives of the wounded and care for the sick, far from the safety of land-based hospitals. Unlike the combat crews who experienced intense, but often brief, periods of battle, the crews of the fleet train faced a different kind of endurance test. Their duties were relentless, repetitive, and often performed in the background of active combat zones. They were constantly underway, constantly moving supplies, constantly ready for the next replenishment or repair mission. The conditions for these crews were often challenging. Monotony versus danger. Long periods of uneventful steaming, punctuated by moments of intense danger during replenishment operations or enemy threats, demanded a unique mental fortitude. Lack of recognition. Their work rarely made headlines or earned distinguished medals, yet its strategic importance was absolute. They were the invisible force that made the visible victories possible. Exposure to elements. Operating on deck during underway replenishment meant constant exposure to the sun, salt, and unpredictable weather of the Pacific, from scorching heat to torrential rain and rough seas. Vulnerability. As auxiliary ships, many were lightly armed and slower than combat vessels, making them prime targets for Japanese submarines or aircraft if detected. Despite these challenges, the morale and professionalism of the fleet train crews remained remarkably high. They understood the critical importance of their mission. The sight of a battle-scarred carrier, freshly fueled and re-armed by their efforts, steaming back into combat, provided a profound sense of purpose. They were a vital link in the chain of victory, and their dedication ensured that the combat ships could continue their relentless advance across the Pacific. The human engine of the fleet train was a diverse cross-section of wartime America, including African Americans, women, serving as nurses or in administrative roles on hospital ships and some shore facilities, and a large contingent of civilian specialists. Their collective effort transcended traditional military roles, demonstrating how industrial capability, when married with human grit and specialized skill, could create an unprecedented logistical advantage. These unsung heroes, operating their floating cities of steel, literally kept the U.S. Navy on the offensive, ensuring that America could outlast Japan and accelerate the path to final victory in the vastness of the Pacific. The successful implementation and continuous operation of the fleet train utterly shattered the Imperial Japanese Navy's most fundamental strategic assumption, that the vast distances of the Pacific would cripple America's ability to wage a sustained, offensive war. Instead, the Island of Steel transformed the logistical landscape, directly fueling the relentless pace of the island-hopping campaign and accelerating the path to victory across the Pacific. Before the fleet train, every major offensive operation would have been followed by a protracted lull, as battle-weary and depleted ships steamed thousands of miles back to Pearl Harbor or the West Coast for replenishment and repair. This was precisely what Japanese admirals factored into their defensive planning, believing they would always have time to reinforce and dig in on the next island. The fleet train completely negated this calculation. The ability to refuel, rearm, and repair at sea, thousands of miles from traditional bases, allowed the U.S. Navy's fast carrier task force, the spearhead of the Pacific offensive, to remain on station, engaged with the enemy, for unprecedented periods. Unrelenting tempo. Task forces could operate continuously for weeks, sometimes months, without withdrawing. This created an unrelenting operational tempo that the Japanese simply could not match. After a grueling battle, instead of a slow retreat for resupply, the U.S. fleet would simply rendezvous with Service Squadron 10, quickly top off, and be ready for the next assault. This constant pressure exhausted Japanese defenders and denied them crucial time to regroup. Strategic flexibility. Commanders like Admiral Chester Nimitz gained enormous strategic flexibility. Knowing they had a mobile logistical backbone, they could plan more ambitious and aggressive operations. They could bypass heavily fortified islands that would have been costly to capture, like Rabaul, knowing that their fleet wouldn't be hobbled by the lack of fixed bases. This allowed for more direct routes to Japan, saving immense time and lives. Sustained power projection. The fleet train enabled the U.S. Navy to project overwhelming power across vast ocean expanses previously thought unmanageable. Battleships could fire more shells, carriers could launch more planes, and destroyers could maintain their screens, all knowing that resupply was only a few hours away, not weeks. This sustained firepower was essential for softening up Japanese island defenses before amphibious assaults. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the operational effectiveness of the fleet train was a source of profound and exasperating bewilderment. They observed that the American fleet was not withdrawing as expected. After major engagements, instead of disappearing for weeks, it would simply reappear, fully fueled and rearmed, seemingly out of nowhere, ready for the next assault. Undermining Japanese doctrine. This directly undermined their core strategy, which banked on America's logistical limitations. Their calculations of attrition and time were rendered obsolete. Intelligence failure. Japanese intelligence consistently underestimated the scale and capability of the fleet train. They simply could not conceive of such a massive, mobile logistical system, leading them to misinterpret Allied intentions and operational timelines. Moral blow. The relentless presence of the U.S. fleet, seemingly immune to the vast distances, was a significant moral blow to Japanese admirals and their crews, fostering a sense of being outmatched not just in combat, but in the very ability to sustain war. The fleet train, therefore, was not just a logistical solution, it was a strategic weapon of immense power. It shattered the tyranny of distance, turned the Pacific into an American-controlled logistical highway, and allowed the U.S. Navy to prosecute the island-hopping campaign with an unprecedented speed and intensity. This continuous, relentless application of power, fueled by Service Squadron 10's floating cities, directly accelerated the path to victory and profoundly shaped the outcome of the Pacific War, proving that a superior logistical system could, indeed, outlast and overwhelm even the most determined enemy. Beyond routine replenishment, one of the most critical, yet often unseen, functions of the fleet train was its revolutionary ability to perform battle damage repair and extensive maintenance directly at the front lines. Historically, a ship suffering significant combat damage or requiring major mechanical overhaul would have been forced to steam thousands of miles back to a home shipyard, a journey that could take weeks or months, removing a vital asset from the fight for a protracted period. The fleet train, through its specialized repair vessels and floating dry docks, completely rewrote this rule, creating a mobile shipyard that kept the U.S. Navy's combat power continuously engaged. The cornerstone of this mobile repair capability were the repair ships, AR, and the floating dry docks, ARD/AFDL. These were not merely barges with a few tools. They were colossal, self-contained industrial complexes afloat, carrying immense capabilities to forward anchorages. Repair ships, AR. These vessels were essentially floating workshops, crammed with every conceivable type of machinery, tools, and spare parts. They housed foundries, welding shops, machine shops, electrical repair facilities, and highly skilled technicians, a diverse crew of naval personnel and civilian specialists. From repairing intricate radar systems and communications gear to patching damaged hull plating and overhauling engines, an AR could perform a staggering array of repairs, often working 24 hours a day on multiple ships simultaneously. Floating dry docks, ARD/AFDL. These were engineering marvels in themselves. Capable of partially or fully submerging, they could lift entire destroyers, submarines, or even light cruisers out of the water for below-the-waterline repairs. This meant that damaged propellers could be replaced, hull plating patched, or structural integrity restored without a lengthy journey to a fixed base. Towed into strategic forward anchorages like Ulithi or Majuro, these dry docks provided indispensable shipyard capabilities directly within the operational theater. The impact of this mobile repair capability on fleet readiness and morale was profound. Rapid return to action. Ships that would have been out of commission for months due to battle damage could often be repaired in a matter of days or weeks. This drastically increased the number of combat ships available at any given time, maintaining the relentless pressure on the Japanese. Boosting morale. For the crews of battle-damaged ships, the sight of a repair ship or floating dry dock arriving in a forward anchorage was an immense morale booster. It meant they wouldn't be sent thousands of miles away from the fight, and their ship would soon be ready to rejoin the battle. It fostered a sense of continuous support and relentless capability. Maintaining operational tempo. The ability to perform major repairs so close to the front ensured that the overall operational tempo of the island-hopping campaign could be maintained. Every recovered ship was a victory, preventing the Japanese from gaining any respite or breathing room. The scale of repairs undertaken by the fleet train's mobile shipyards was astonishing. After major engagements, such as the Battle of Leyte Gulf, battle-damaged ships would converge on forward anchorages like Ulithi. Here, the repair ships and floating dry docks would work around the clock, patching up everything from destroyers with major structural damage to cruisers needing extensive engine overhauls. This continuous cycle of combat, repair, and return to action was a logistical miracle, directly countering the traditional limitations of naval warfare. For Japanese admirals, this mobile repair capability was yet another baffling and demoralizing aspect of the American war machine. They had no comparable system. Their damaged ships had to make the long, vulnerable journey back to home ports for repairs, often taking them out of the war permanently. The continuous presence of the U.S. fleet, seemingly capable of healing its wounds at sea, cemented their growing realization that America's industrial and logistical might was truly insurmountable. The fleet train's mobile shipyards were a silent, steel fist, constantly patching the wounds of battle and ensuring the relentless, unstoppable march across the Pacific. Behind the impressive statistics and revolutionary tactics of the fleet train lay the tireless efforts of tens of thousands of unsung heroes, the sailors and civilian workers who comprised the crews of these auxiliary ships. Their work, often arduous, dangerous, and monotonous, lacked the glory of combat, but it was absolutely indispensable to the success of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific. Their story is one of profound dedication, resilience, and the quiet heroism that underpins monumental military achievements. The crews of the fleet train ships came from all walks of life, encompassing a vast array of specialized skills. Oiler crews. These sailors faced the constant, dirty, and dangerous work of handling highly volatile fuels, ensuring smooth transfer operations, and battling the elements on deck. Their role was foundational to keeping the entire fleet moving. Ammunition handlers. On ammunition ships, these men performed one of the most perilous jobs in the Navy. Handling thousands of tons of live ordnance, often in rough seas and under pressure, required absolute precision and nerves of steel. An accidental detonation could instantly vaporize their ship. Stores and provision crews. These individuals meticulously managed immense inventories of food, spare parts, and other supplies. Their work ensured that everything from a critical engine component to a fresh apple made its way to the right ship at the right time, maintaining both operational readiness and crew morale. Repairmen and technicians. The repair ships were floating communities of highly skilled engineers, mechanics, welders, electricians, and other tradesmen. These civilian and military specialists could fix almost anything, from a damaged propeller to complex radar arrays, often working 24 hours a day to return battle-damaged ships to action. Medical personnel. On hospital ships, doctors, nurses, and corpsmen worked tirelessly, often under immense emotional strain, to save the lives of the wounded and care for the sick, far from the safety of land-based hospitals. Unlike the combat crews who experienced intense, but often brief, periods of battle, the crews of the fleet train faced a different kind of endurance test. Their duties were relentless, repetitive, and often performed in the background of active combat zones. They were constantly underway, constantly moving supplies, constantly ready for the next replenishment or repair mission. The conditions for these crews were often challenging. Monotony versus danger. Long periods of uneventful steaming, punctuated by moments of intense danger during replenishment operations or enemy threats, demanded a unique mental fortitude. Lack of recognition. Their work rarely made headlines or earned distinguished medals, yet its strategic importance was absolute. They were the invisible force that made the visible victories possible. Exposure to elements. Operating on deck during underway replenishment meant constant exposure to the sun, salt, and unpredictable weather of the Pacific, from scorching heat to torrential rain and rough seas. Vulnerability. As auxiliary ships, many were lightly armed and slower than combat vessels, making them prime targets for Japanese submarines or aircraft if detected. Despite these challenges, the morale and professionalism of the fleet train crews remained remarkably high. They understood the critical importance of their mission. The sight of a battle-scarred carrier, freshly fueled and re-armed by their efforts, steaming back into combat, provided a profound sense of purpose. They were a vital link in the chain of victory, and their dedication ensured that the combat ships could continue their relentless advance across the Pacific. The human engine of the fleet train was a diverse cross-section of wartime America, including African Americans, women, serving as nurses or in administrative roles on hospital ships and some shore facilities, and a large contingent of civilian specialists. Their collective effort transcended traditional military roles, demonstrating how industrial capability, when married with human grit and specialized skill, could create an unprecedented logistical advantage. These unsung heroes, operating their floating cities of steel, literally kept the U.S. Navy on the offensive, ensuring that America could outlast Japan and accelerate the path to final victory in the vastness of the Pacific. By the final years of World War II, the revolutionary concept of the fleet train, spearheaded by Service Squadron 10, had decisively transformed naval warfare and etched its indelible mark on the Allied victory in the Pacific. What began as an audacious solution to the tyranny of distance had matured into a fully realized island of steel, a self-sustaining logistical behemoth that redefined the capabilities of a fighting fleet. This ultimate island, built not of land but of purpose-built ships, proved to be Japan's undoing and America's path to an accelerated victory. The legacy of the fleet train is profound and multifaceted. Revolution in naval logistics. The fleet train fundamentally rewrote naval doctrine. It proved that a major fleet could operate continuously, thousands of miles from fixed bases, for months on end. This concept of mobile logistical support became the standard for all modern navies, enabling global power projection and sustained operations far from home. Accelerating Pacific victory. By eliminating the need for constant withdrawals to distant shipyards, the fleet train dramatically accelerated the pace of the island-hopping campaign. It allowed the U.S. Navy to maintain relentless pressure on Japan, denying them crucial time to fortify and regroup, ultimately shortening the war and saving countless lives. Industrial and engineering marvel. The sheer scale of building, converting, and operating hundreds of specialized auxiliary ships, from massive oilers and ammunition ships to complex repair vessels and floating dry docks, was a monumental feat of industrial mobilization and engineering ingenuity. It showcased America's unparalleled wartime production capacity and its ability to innovate logistical solutions on an unprecedented scale. Unsung heroes, the thousands of sailors and civilian workers who manned these floating cities, performing arduous, dangerous, and often monotonous duties, were the unsung heroes of the Pacific War. Their dedication, professionalism, and resilience in keeping the fleet supplied and repaired, often under threat of enemy attack, were absolutely indispensable to victory. Their story is a powerful testament to the vital contributions of all personnel, regardless of their direct combat role. Baffling the enemy. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the fleet train was a continuous source of bewilderment and demoralization. Their strategic calculus, based on America's logistical limitations, was utterly shattered. The U.S. fleet's ability to consistently reappear, fully fueled and rearmed, seemingly immune to distance and attrition, was a psychological blow that underscored Japan's inability to match America's industrial and organizational might. Today, the principles pioneered by Service Squadron 10 and the fleet train remain fundamental to the operation of modern navies worldwide. The image of ships refueling and rearming at sea is now commonplace, a direct descendant of the revolutionary concepts forged in the crucible of the Pacific War. America's Island of Steel was more than just a collection of ships. It was a testament to strategic vision, relentless innovation, and the indomitable spirit of its people. It proved that in the vastness of the Pacific, distance could be conquered, logistical challenges could be overcome, and a truly decisive victory could be fueled by the power of an unseen, mobile logistical revolution. The fleet train ensured that the U.S. Navy could outlast Japan and, through continuous, sustained power, ultimately steer the course towards the final triumph.